Wonderful. So moving on to our third speaker of today, Callum Bateson. Am I saying that right? So please do correct me if I'm not. Wonderful. So Callum holds a BA in English and Italian and an MPhil in creative writing from Trinity College Dublin, so our homestead, and is currently a postgraduate research student in the environmental humanities at, and I will say this incorrectly, so I'm very sorry, Free University at Amsterdam?
I'm not much terrible, so I think like, I don't know, it's the Freie Universität Amsterdam, but that also might be quite German. I don't know.
I will apologies to everybody listening whose first language I have butchered. His research is concerned with decoloniality and the so-called Anthropocene. Callum will be presenting his paper, Between an Ocean and a Rock, Liminality, Gender and the Environment in Song of the Sea. So go ahead, Callum, whenever you're ready.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll just share my screen 1 second. Oh, this is always fun. Sorry. Oh yeah. Right. I hope everyone can see that. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Does it move when I move it as well? Because that was an issue I've had before.
No, it's not moving or anything. It's fine. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So yeah. Firstly, just want to say my thanks to Tom and to Alicia for this organizing this brilliant conference and for making a really, really beautiful conference outline as well. The design is very nice. And also thanks to the speakers so far. They've been super interesting. So I hope this talk kind of connects to some of the themes that have kind of come up in the past two topics. Obviously, it's kind of going from, I suppose, much like wider colonial context into the kind of liminal space that Ireland is in terms of being a European country, being a victim, but also being to some extent a beneficiary of imperialism. But I'm going to be zoning into the movie Song of the Sea and yeah, exploring liminality kind of and how it functions in it. So for those of you who are not familiar with the movie, did the slide change there just because I'm aware? No, it didn't. Yeah, sorry, 1 second. Come on. Okay, I think now it's working properly.
It is on a different slide. Yes, it's
brilliant.
Working.
Sorry about this.
No,
okay.
no, that's fine.
So, Song of the Sea is a 2014 co-production, which was produced by Cartoon Saloon based in Kilkenny and written and directed by Tom Moore. And it tells the story of Saoirse, who is the daughter of Connor, who's a lighthouse keeper, and Brona, who is a Selkie, her mother, which is a part human, part seal mythological being, but we'll come back to that later. Basically, it revolves around what you need to know, a quest to find, for her, Saoirse, to find a kind of her Selkie identity. But this is complicated by the resistance from her father, who throws away her coat into the sea, and her grandmother, who takes her and her brother Ben to Dublin. And then the movie develops into a kind of a quest to save herself, and as well as this, the people of the other world, or the Dina Sheep, in a kind of interconnected mission to save both their fates. So what I want to ask in this paper and today is how the way liminality in this film might help us understand how liminality might function more generally and specifically in Ireland. I think in Ireland's case particularly, ideas of liminality are relevant because constructions of Irish identity traditionally, and still extend to this day, are relatively narrow and somewhat allergic to pluralism, despite erosion of church influence and despite, many more discussions online and offline surrounding identity issues. This narrowness presents issues for those outside, who lie outside of the bounds of Irishness. And we see this where in Ireland there are much higher rates of racism against people of colour and mincry or travelling communities compared to the Western European average. And as well as their people from lower income backgrounds are often told that class doesn't exist in Ireland while being systemically excluded from both housing and labour markets. This monolithic idea of a sort of, and I'm going to call it a middle class Irishness because that's kind of who it caters for, presents policy issues, and practical issues, which I think are illustrated quite nicely through many of the COVID measures we've seen. I'm particularly minded of the heavy-handed criticism of younger people in parks and whatever, say, drinking, being told, well, shouldn't you be in your gardens when they're living in shared accommodation with no space in cities. It also allows long-term discrimination and abuse to occur within society. And in the context of this movie, something I'd like to pick up on a bit, which this is a kind of afterthought of my research, but is the sidelining of children's rights and children within Irish society. And I think it's interesting in this way to think that this movie was made in 2014, which is only 2 years after the 2012 referendum on the right to ratify the UN rights of the child, which led to the creation of the Department of Children. However, as we've seen through multiple issues over the last 10 years, despite this, there is still many gaps within the protection of children's rights in Ireland. And I think, yeah, it's interesting to think about that, given this movie centers children and their agency. Okay, so to try and resolve this or look for ways we can kind of move on from this narrowness, I think it's interesting to look at spaces where difference and plurality thrive. And this is where the movie comes in. So, where am I? So to do so, I'm going to be using as a kind of backdrop spatial theory to help us understand how liminality works. I mean, liminality, I also want to say, is a bit of an academic trope. It's a very used and overused word. I still think it's pretty helpful, though, perhaps because of its broadness and the things that it covers. It's found expression from theorists from Agamben to Foucault's heterotopias to the non-places of Auger, the space of late modernity and capitalism. For this talk, however, I think most relevant are Bell Hooks and Edward Saya's imaginations of the term third space. And Saya imagines such spaces as being home to communities of difference, which can foster societal change and allow what Bell Hooks terms radical openness. So an example of this might be queer spaces in LGBTQIA plus hostile countries, i.e. most countries. And these spaces might be bars or clubs or community spaces which shelter people, but also, and this is important, allow alternative philosophies to flourish parallel to mainstream society. So these offer sanctuary, essentially, that allow the minded to thrive. I think it's worth asking, in terms of spatially and practically, what makes such spaces liminal? Because if they sit parallel rather than, but separate from the mainstream, are they liminal? Because liminal implies a sort of threshold or transversal identity. I would argue that it is through their usage and the people that use them that these spaces become imbued with liminality. Like a park or a warehouse or whatever is not liminal in of itself, but when you or a person goes from one space to another, different aspects of their identity will be expressed in different senses. And so, so basically here, I want to look at 3 zones of liminality in specific to the movie. Firstly, the zone or the idea of the Selkie as a figure. And then I would like to talk a little bit about the figure of Connor in relation to parenthood and motherhood, traditional motherhood, that is to say. And then looking at the grandmother as a way to view kind of historical thresholds or historical liminalities. So the most kind of, actually I'll go back to that, the most obvious expression of liminality is found through the Selkie figure. So we have Brona and Saoirse in this row. You see Saoirse here putting on the Selkie coat for the first time. So this Selkie, to give a bit of background, has had a long held important role in folklore, particularly in coastal regions, so along the Atlantic coast of Ireland, but also in Nordic countries, in Scotland, and quite possibly in northern Spain, although I'm not too familiar with folklore from there. And I would imagine, I don't know anything about Canada, but it would have been interesting to see if that occurs maybe in Indigenous communities where seals are also present. Anyway, this importance, as explored, is related to their economic importance, which is something Niamh Ní Lochlin explores in her article on seal folklore. So they were used for food, for oil, which was used in lighting, as well as for clothing. Though they were killed for these reasons, Niamh Ní Lachlan notes that Creidir go leide go raibh miai a buint leis, mar go díana friasi iad na rónta, is fudastar an creidiún sin a hiisbint mar go maran an rón muir agus tír gan buint gur chumáin na ceachtar, agus is minic is ag intrictí den station creidiúntí áirithe. That is to say that it was strongly believed that killing seals brought bad luck, as seals were people under enchantment. It's easy to understand this belief as the seal lives both on land and on the sea and in the sea, without being completely of either, and such ambiguity commonly led to certain or particular beliefs occurring. You might ask why such fear exists towards those occupying liminal figures, particularly amongst adults in this film. I would say that in the case of Connor, who we see here, he's traumatized by the loss of his partner, Brona, who leaves at the birth of Saoirse into the sea and resumes her seal or Selkie identity, and is afraid that he'll lose his entire family to the sea if he allows Saoirse to embrace liminality and take back the coat. Meanwhile, then the grandmother, who is the other main figure that's quite resistant to change, I would argue is receptive to societal constructs of what a family should be, and this way influences her thinking. We can see this in the way in which she says that the island on which the lighthouse is located is no place for children, as well as the disapproval she initially shows towards the way in which Saoirse is dressed when she visits for her birthday. Kate Shadburn contends that folklore implies that the best way to remain safe is to conform to the rest of the community and to observe its rhythms and patterns carefully. I would argue that both the father and the grandmother subscribe to this way of thinking, and Saoirse's non-conformity and her embrace for liminal identity represents a threat or a danger to the traditional family structure. In some senses, this is understandable. Rituals and superstitions help individuals make sense of the world, and events and people that destabilize such ideas appear threatening. I would also say that Connor and the grandmother's unease with Saoirse's liminality might stem from the way it highlights their own liminal identities, and indeed everyone's liminal identities. And again, we can maybe, going back to my initial point about children and youth in Ireland, we can maybe relate this back to a fear of youth or a fear of change more generally in Ireland. And again, maybe it'd be interesting to look at other relatively recently independent countries in this sense. So Connor, though he is a stereotypical heterosexual cisgender man, big birdie, Brendan Gleeson of a man, he also occupies a role as a single parent, and therefore is representing what is stereotyped as a traditionally feminine role of the primary caregiver. The breaking down of these gender roles is displayed in a scene where he's craving Saoirse, which you can see there, where this image echoes quite neatly the iconic image of the Madonna and Child, placing him firmly within a Catholic aesthetic of motherhood. This is interesting because in relation to the stigmatization of single parents, both past and present, within Irish society, from the mother and baby homes to current discrimination within our welfare system. This then can be, this kind of outsider context can be then drawn alongside the primacy given to mother figures in the construction of Irish national identities. This as a whole complexifies this Connor. He is both an insider and an outsider within society, and yet, unlike Saoirse, he's unable to accept this. This might be to do with the judgment he suffers from his mother, the grandmother. If Connor's discomfort is with Saoirse's both part human, part Selkie identity, the grandmother struggles with her son's hybrid position as both mother and father figure. Given the movie suggests she is strongly Catholic, it is likely that she was raised with the idea that a woman's role is to be a mother and to care for children, and indeed this is still enshrined within the Irish Constitution. Her son's experience, however, challenges this idea and complicates her own the basis on which her own identity and bounds of Irishness are based. So the grandmother rather, might appear like quite a simple case of a very traditional, quite harsh Irish parental figure. However, she is also a hybrid because while she lives in a city removed from both the ocean in distance and aesthetic, and she's a devout Catholic, which we can observe from I don't have a picture of the house, unfortunately, but we can observe from her house, which is full of Catholic iconography, from the Sacred Heart, the Child of Prague, and even the Virgin Mary by her bed. She's also connected to the supernatural world. When Saoirse transforms at the start of the film into a Selkie for the first time, it is the grandmother who wakes up and rushes to the beach, suggesting that she is close to Saoirse's hybridity than one would initially think. This connection is reinforced then towards the end of the movie, when she is once more jolted awake as Saoirse and Ben, propelled by Mochlear's dogs, start the final part of their journey back to the lighthouse. In both cases, the grandmother is wakened by a magical force underlying, which represents an older supernatural identity below the surface of modern Ireland. I'd also just like to briefly draw attention to the image of the brooch here, because this is like an earlier cue right from the start of the movie. There's a tie between the figure here of the Taoiseach, the fairy people, and the grandmother. They're both wearing this Celtic brooch. And it's interesting also just to touch upon how similar this looks to stereotypical communist flags. And again, this might represent a subversion of the state Catholic capitalism that emerged in post-Civil War Ireland. Of course, this isn't the only example of how intertwined modern Ireland is with an older pre-colonial culture. Subversion, when taken literally, points to that which lies beneath. And the subversion of solid binaries in the film confirms this spatially. If the Catholic nation is omnipotent, it is only so on a surface layer. The Dublin skyline might be a clutch of spires, but older systems still flourish below. Indeed, one of the entrances to the city's ferry port is guarded by a statue of Mary, while in the Holy Well, which we can see here, outside it's topped by a crucifix and decorated inside with the paraphernalia of Catholicism, but clearly has older roots as a Celtic or pre-Celtic ring fort, and operates as a portal to an underground river and to the Great Shanachie. Many of the female statues we can see within here may be initially taken to be Mary, but could also represent the Celtic goddess Breed, or indeed Sheelanagigs. So I think to really reinforce this dissolving of boundaries, we can see this in this image here, where Ben jumps into the well in the ferry fort, but very, very quickly, the rosary beads of Catholicism are replaced by Celtic symbols as he goes deeper, suggesting the relative insignificance of Catholicism when compared to Irish history in its totality, allowing a kind of analysis of deep time in this sense. I also believe this might hint at the tendency to ignore pre-colonial histories or reduce them to mere mythologies when compared to the history during colonial periods. This isn't, though, to sideline or to reduce how ominous the backdrop of Catholicism is, both in the movie and in Ireland more generally. Religion permeates even those intimate spaces of the home, which we can see through the aforementioned statue in the grandmother's bedroom of Mary. And this kind of shows a Catholic church which is always awake and always watching, a sort of panopticon, if you will. Given that much of the power of the Catholic Church in Ireland relied on a network of people willing to inform on friends and family to uphold its social norms, even abroad within Irish diasporic communities, this symbolism, I believe, is apt. So what we've just kind of gone through there is a lot of different liminalities. It's a lot of different identities and so on. And to sort of like, as we move towards the end of this talk, try and at least tie it together somewhat, I want to move on to a theory which I believe might help with this, which is the idea of the ocean, or the ocean as a third space. The ocean is a space which is perceptive to liminality. To help with this, I'm going to briefly touch on the theorist Siobhan Carroll's concept of the ocean as a natural atopia. In her book, An Empire of Air, she characterizes the ocean as a space outside of the control of the nation, and I quote, as separate from the normal landscape of the nation state. Despite their otherness, Carroll observes that such space is a society revealing. They, atopias, register anxieties concerning spatial transformations taking place in the national domestic, end quote. Though the film complicates liminalities and presents quite a complex picture, eventually it is in the natural atopia of the ocean that balance and some kind of resolution is found at the very end, which you can see in this image here. In this way, The ocean allows Saoirse the freedom eventually to express her liminality, and uh, which from the start of the movie we see is contested somewhat, where her fluency in the water indicates a point of difference between her and Ben and her father, arousing suspicion within them. Despite the fact that like her father makes a living from the sea, he does keep his distance from it, which is reflected in many real-life pishtoga around how dangerous the sea was. This is true with Ben as well. He warns Saoirse to keep out of the water at the start, and even though he does go into rescue her, he struggles even in the shallows. Over the course of this film, and at the end, he's forced to face his fear, eventually finding some kind of solace and comfort in the sea at the end, again in the ocean. You might consider it odd that Saoirse would be comfortable while Ben is not, given they're both related and both share Celtic heritage. However, if we consider the ocean as a third space, this perhaps makes a bit more sense. If, as Carol argues, the ocean corrodes social order, this potentially makes it threatening to cisgender males such as Ben and Connor. But for Saoirse, as for many women and other minoritized groups in Ireland, the ocean offers an escape from the framework of the nation. Most relevant, perhaps, is its role in allowing women to access reproductive rights. But it also applies as a space of freedom for a range of social restrictions faced by people in Ireland over the years. Though Saoirse is not as directly impacted, perhaps, by the laws of the nation as pregnant people, she faces restrictions that Ben does not, and finds eventually her freedom in the space of the ocean. Though an object of fear for many in the film and in folklore more generally, the ocean's refusal to bend to the will of the nation makes it a space of resistance, or a third space. The ocean, historically, has offered a way out for starving immigrants in the 19th century and women in need of medical care in both the 20th and the 21st. And in the 2018 referendum to repeal the Eighth Amendment, the direction of travel was reversed as tens of thousands of people came home to vote, helping ensure that future generations would not have to need to access reproductive healthcare, although this is still very much a work in progress. Change, as is often the case in Irish history, came from the waves. So to conclude, I want to finish on reflecting on what we can learn from the sea's embrace of liminality, and perhaps by looking at the land from the ocean. As we stand here towards the end, hopefully, of a pandemic, although, of course, we don't know, questions of climate crisis, globalization, and global inequality loom large. These are intertangled, overlapping crises that are the consequence of centuries of extractivist capitalism. Faced with such issues, Ireland and other countries face a choice: to reinforce existing ideas through the continued illegalization of people, the normalization of housing crisis, and the absorption of neoliberal doctrine as state policy, or to embrace liminality and stay with the trouble. Deleuze and Guattari suggest the concept of being nomad in this sense, but perhaps in an Irish context, it might be more pertinent to suggest the idea of being Selkie. So, Gurad Mahagriv, thank you for listening. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Callum. That was incredible. I really enjoyed that. Thank you so much.